how are you as a corporation or an organization that works in this space effectively leveraging technology as best as you can to continue to amplify the voices of people who might not always be included in consultation sessions or who don't always get to talk to the social auditor who comes to the factory for an audit.
Human trafficking doesn't always take the form we first imagine. It can be found at almost any level of an organization's supply chain. What can compliance professionals do to assess human trafficking risk, and how can they leverage the resources of the organizations they work for to help root out this tragic problem? Gwen Hassan is here to help. This is Hidden Traffic.
Hello, this is Gwen Hassan, and welcome to another episode of Hidden Traffic. I am thrilled today to have as our guest Vera Belazelkoska, the Director of Programs with Ulula. And if you're like me, you're probably thinking, as I was until a couple of weeks ago, Ulula, what is Ulula? I don't know what that means. And we're about to find out. So thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's start right at the beginning. Tell our listeners a little bit about you and your background. How did you start working in kind of the human trafficking and human rights space? Let's get a little inside scoop on Vera. Tell us about yourself.
So my background's in political economy of international development. Prior to moving to Canada and working here in Canada, I used to work in different parts of the world, oftentimes quite interested in the aspects of the social economy, trade, equitable trade, and sustainable economic development. And having had experiences working and living in Namibia, Nicaragua, Thailand, as well as Argentina, which was where I lived last before immigrating to Canada, I was always really struck by and motivated by issues of equity and oftentimes looking at the different kind of levers of power within the international economic system and international trade. After finishing my master's degree, I decided to embark on this kind of new and interesting sector called the sort of social enterprise and social innovation space. I was fortunate to meet two very inspiring people who had co-founded Ulula shortly before I joined them, and was really intrigued by the concept of leveraging and accessible, inclusive technologies, mixing that with innovative methodologies and data to tackle some of the most egregious crimes that are still very much prevalent around the world: human trafficking, child labor, modern day slavery. And it was quite a natural fit, given that I was starting to get more and more interested in issues of corporate responsibilities and how they relate to international trade and sourcing.
I love that evolution that you started, one place. And I'm a Spanish speaker as well, and a big fan of working in Latin America. So when we were speaking before, as soon as you said that you had worked in Argentina, I was like, oh, there it is. Somebody who also speaks Spanish. And I love the fact that that kind of evolved from a place of, I'm interested in economies and helping develop economies and microeconomics and empowering local people to develop economies, to now leveraging technology to make the world a better place, I guess is the kind of higher way to look at it. So let's dive right into what Ulula is. So when we talked about it before, I looked through your website, which is how I found you in the first place. I came away with kind of a big picture summary that it's a company that designs technology solutions to help companies do better in many areas, but let's say specifically maybe supply chain and supply chain transparency. Is that more or less accurate? And tell us a little more.
Yes, of course. So at Ulula, we're really looking at how we can build, configure, and successfully implement these different innovative tools to help organizations monitor human rights issues, labor rights impacts, and community rights in global supply chains. So transparency is part of it, but we really also do focus on the accountability aspect. So how can you create a system where you are really continuously and effectively and in an inclusive manner listening to your key stakeholders, whether that be the workers in the factories from which you source in your supply chain, or the communities that are impacted by extractive operations in host communities and countries. How are you as a corporation or an organization that works in this space effectively leveraging technology as best as you can to continue to amplify the voices of people who might not always be included in consultation sessions or who don't always get to talk to the social auditor who comes to the factory for an audit? How can you really broaden the sample, make the process easy, and of course, make it anonymous? So really for it to feel safe for people to whistleblow and raise issues and concerns, and then making sure that that insight lands on the right ears. So how can we not just collect data for the sake of collecting data, but how can we make sure it's turned into insights so that companies have access to this to say, wow, this is a new hotspot for us. For example, textile mills in this part of the world, we didn't think there was an issue, but it seems like there's new practices or new dynamics that are putting workers at greater risk for having their labor rights effectively disrespected. And I think it relates very strongly to the human trafficking challenge, which is, again, a lot of human trafficking around the world is for sexual exploitation and for forced labor. Corporations are, of course, now held to a pretty high standard to have to
increasingly high standard
across different jurisdictions to make sure that they do everything they can to find out about this and then remediate it if there are instances of forced labor or human trafficking in their supply chain. So yeah, it's really looking at both aspects of transparency and accountability using technology. And we definitely don't approach technology from a perspective of complete technology enthusiast. Technology will solve everything as a silver bullet. We are, half IT, half social scientists on the team. So it's a really good balance of also treating it with skepticism and thinking around, okay, is this actually going to do something in this case? Will this be helpful? And also learning and iterating as we go so that we know that we are deploying the tools that matter and that might make the biggest impact. And of course, no technology platform on its own is going to be a solution on its own without the right accountability structures. But it is the thing that we focus on, and oftentimes why we partner with other organizations and experts who can provide the additional kind of expertise and support in ensuring that the technology does reach the right stakeholders, so the workers, the community members, but it also that it gets to the places of decision making, the data gets to the places of decision making, so that something could potentially be done about what companies are learning about their supply chains.
Vera, I think that's just fantastic because there's so many parts of the world. What pops to mind immediately is Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, and kind of the conflict minerals issues there, where we're getting information directly from the workforce seems at least nearly impossible. And it's dangerous places where people literally are subject to horrible atrocities and their lives are at risk. And the fact that, there are solutions like this, a technology solution where you might be able to use it to directly reach workers. I know not in every part of the world, but in some parts is amazing. And I think a wonderful advancement.
Yes, of course. So the technology is a software. It can be easily accessed through any mobile browser, through its own safety access to factor authentication, ensuring that access is monitored and it's used by people who have the right access levels to that data. Through the software itself is connecting to various channels that then workers or communities can use. For example, while the interface, the data dashboards are more advanced and they are software as a service platform, the stakeholder with which we engage, provide information or source information, they can use their existing devices. So that would mean their mobile phone. And that mobile phone doesn't have to be a smartphone and they don't have to have data. So in those programs, we look at, depending on the country and the population, if it's a farming community in the highlands of Ecuador, we probably need to think about offline channels because not everybody will have a smartphone or access to affordable data. So we will combine things like WhatsApp as a channel with text message or with interactive voice response or IVR. Also for populations who might speak indigenous languages that are not written, then we really do need to think about using voice-based channels to ensure that the tools are accessible to everyone and that they're inclusive. We also have built an app, and we're, more and more of the world is getting connected online, and smartphones are becoming more affordable. But until everybody does have access, we always have to think about a combination of online and offline channels to ensure that what we're building is used by everyone. And often the tools themselves, they will often comprise of combination of things like short pulse surveys or longer community perception surveys or labor working conditions surveys. And the methodology and the questions have been tested with focus groups, with partners, to make sure we're always using language that's accessible and easy for people to understand, and often using proxy indicators too. So for example, for human trafficking, it's not advisable to ask somebody, are you being trafficked? Because they might not identify that, but you can ask them a series of questions to then identify whether they might be at risk of it. So things like, are you in possession of your passport or travel document? Or did you pay somebody a fee to be able to come and work here? Are part of your wages being withheld? All of these things can contribute to a risk assessment of medium, high, or low. So we really do kind of approach the aspect from the perception of the worker community member. How would they interact with this? Would this be something they would feel safe continuing to answer? And then, of course, we couple the data collection aspect with more things, because it's never going to work if we're only asking people for their feedback and they don't really hear anything back from the tools. So we do have a tool where we can broadcast information. So in some projects, we send out rights-based information. Sometimes it could be information that the company wants to send to the stakeholder group, or opening up a two-way anonymized grievance or complaints mechanism, so that people, while they could also participate in data collection efforts that are more trying to spot risk on different topics, they also could use the channel to raise a particular issue they have that maybe isn't shared by everybody, and an issue that they need a remediation for. And often these grievance systems could be managed by a third party. It could be the employers in collaboration with third parties, in collaboration with brands. So we do have different projects with different actors involved, but definitely the grievance mechanism system via digital is becoming one of the more used platforms from Ulula.
I am amazed and quite frankly embarrassed, because you're talking about indigenous languages and proxy language and making sure people have psychological safety and reporting, and not using labels that are intimidating. I had a conversation at a conference actually earlier this week with someone who literally asked me, an established compliance professional, whether or not they should really consider translating their helpline information into languages other than English. It makes you want to bang your head against a wall. I mean, yes, you should. I mean, how arrogant to think that, everyone should speak English, and that if you push information out in English, that makes it somehow accessible to people who may not even have any written language, let alone English. So I'm really impressed with the fact that Ulula is taking that kind of truly inclusive approach to establishing equity in the use of your technology. I mean, there's, I think, a lot of companies who have a long way to go in that area, and how nice that you're already kind of purpose built in that way. Fantastic. All right, so let's take that then and move towards kind of the practical, because I can almost hear podcast listeners saying, okay, give me examples. I want to know how this is actually used in real life. I know you're already present in a number of sectors that we talked about, and your website shows you've got, agriculture clients, manufacturing, mining, electronics, I'm sure many others. Could you give us a couple of examples of, anonymized, of course, of how clients are maybe using this in the field or in their compliance programs? And I saw reference on your website to OWL, and I think that's the app. So could you tell us a little bit more about that too?
Yes, of course. And I can give a couple examples. One of them from one of our NGO partners that is in the trafficking space that I can very much disclose. I can also speak to that. But one example, now we're in the second year of a quite global program with a retailer. They are very much interested in working with their own direct suppliers for their own label. Of course, they have very strategic suppliers for different brands, but they were very much wanting to take an approach of supplier advancement and enabling their direct suppliers that are very strategic to begin to be empowered by these kinds of tools. So this is very much a supplier engagement and supplier ownership type of program, but we've been working with this retailer and their supply chain in various countries to both develop a bit of a baseline on what are workers' priorities.
Okay.
And we look at topics like satisfaction and mental health and stress and impacts of COVID, but also some additional key performance indicators related to potential risk, labor risk, and whether that does include topics of forced labor, human trafficking, but just to be able to note, okay, there might be a lot of hiring through labor agencies in a particular country, in a particular region. Could that be an area that the retailer then has to spend additional resources and time investigating further? While at the same time really partnering with the suppliers and making sure that they understand that this is not just a simple compliance program where they pass or fail, but actually like we can work with them to help improve. So thinking around trainings and corrective action plans that they can take. And we work with local associates in these countries that come from the social compliance space. So they're experts in the local law, but also experts in engaging with suppliers, how to help them, because buy-in is really important.
Yeah.
Some projects are very much on the monitoring end, monitoring for risk, more for avoiding risk.
Mm-hmm.
So when you monitor to avoid risk, you can achieve certain outcomes. But in terms of impact, it's not always clear. Because if you just want to avoid risks, sourcing in a particular country, a particular product could mean that you could reduce your risk if you just source elsewhere.
If you remove yourself.
Yeah, but you would have quite some unintended consequences. People could lose their jobs if you stop purchasing in that region. It really could have an impact on the local economy. So these programs where we get to work with the suppliers to help them improve, help them understand the codes of conduct that they're supposed to abide by are hard work. They're long, takes a lot of effort, but they're really worth because we can see these improvements happening. And this particular program does have both surveying of workers, kind of baseline end line to measure change over time to see if any of the activities of the supplier are influencing workers' perceptions, but also having a third-party grievance mechanism so that if a worker cannot resolve their issue with the employer, they can actually escalate it and try to have it resolved. And our local associates act as arbiters, as support to try to align the different parties. And our client, of course, being able to consume some of this high-level data and step in where they have to step in. They tend to really just focus on the high-risk issues that might not be getting resolved. So it's really a partnership type of program, and it's really rewarding, I think, for all stakeholders. In terms of the app, it's been quite an interesting development over time. Of course, in the beginning, we really worked on the low-tech aspect. So really kind of innovating by scaling down the technology because there's enough apps for everything. So we wanted to make sure, okay, but the hardest to reach people, do they have apps? Do they have smartphones? Are these apps in their languages? So we really wanted to make sure we start from the low-tech and build up. So we're at that time now when we are working in some mega cities, mega production cities, economic zones in parts of China and Vietnam that, they're quite advanced and all workers do have smartphones. So we have adapted our app for workers as well. And for example, we are running the app with a global fashion brand and they're using it in some of their strategic suppliers as well as suppliers in high-risk countries. So that's where they also have a little bit more power to make it mandatory to say, look, this is a high-risk region. There's enough data that there are risks of forced labor, human trafficking, and we want you to deploy this. And as part of their contract and their purchasing engagement, it's not a matter of you have to do X and Y. It's just let us hear from your workers and then we'll work together on what needs to get done. And most of the brands we work with, they commit to working with suppliers rather than walking away. And in the 7.5 years I've been with Ulula, we've never had a situation where a supplier has said, oh, too much risk, I'll go elsewhere, let's cancel the program. That has never happened. And we're quite grateful for that. That's a good trend.
I love the idea that they're in it for the long haul, that they're here to actually, as you said, make a social impact, not just gather data and then decide the risk is too high and leave. And how great that it would never have occurred to me that you made that a contracting requirement with a supplier. And that, hey, if you would like to be our supplier, you're going to allow us to talk to your employees, and here's the app that you will need to provide them with access to. That's fantastic. I love this. What does OWL stand for, by the way?
It stands for Open Worker Line.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. And in a podcast, it's not a visual medium, so you cannot see the Ulula logo, but it is a little owl. And because it's wise and it sees in the dark, so we hope to be in places where, and to hopefully uncover things that might be difficult to see. And Ulula, it means to reveal in a Southern African language called Chichewa. So really it's about that additional layer of viewing and insight that you might not get from the existing tools and processes that companies currently use. Yeah.
Bringing light to places that used to be dark. I think that's an amazing corporate mission to have. Bravo.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
This has been a treat for me because, as is often the case when I host an episode, I end up learning as much as my listeners do. So this is wonderful. Mm-hmm. Any additional thoughts or information you'd like to add before we wrap up?
I thought I would share a little bit about our project that I can speak quite a bit more freely about, which is collaborating together with the Human Trafficking Hotline in the United States, Polaris. They are one of our NGO partners. And as I mentioned, we work with companies and industry associations and governments in some cases. We also do work with some unions, and we do work with NGOs, especially in innovation projects that are more on the landscape aspect. So really tackling things like issues of monitoring child labor in cocoa, in particular regions of Cote d'Ivoire or Ghana. So these mega projects that are not necessarily specifically addressing the issues of one company and their direct supply chain, but rather it's oftentimes these agricultural supply chains where
industry overall.
Exactly. And they're quite difficult to map. So with Polaris, we have a really interesting project called Nonechka, and it started in Mexico looking at leveraging technology to monitor the risk of human trafficking for internal migrants, so interstate migrants within different parts of Mexico, mostly working in agriculture. And now that program has scaled to the United States, where Polaris and implementing partners, oftentimes worker support networks, legal support networks for migrant workers, they're using the tool to not only, again, source insight from workers to potentially begin to map risks of human trafficking, but also to push information to them. So we have, for example, a legal center in New York that's wanting to use the tool now for two-way engagement with workers, as well as pushing information like, hey, did you know if you don't have a contract, this could be a risk? Or do you have a contract in Spanish? Do you understand your contract? So things like that, so that workers also are building their awareness so they can advocate for their rights, and then they have access to recourse. So we are, as much as the tool is built and we have lots of different methods and processes for transparency and accountability in global supply chains, we are always looking at the aspect of impact. And this is where social enterprise is a good place for Ulula, because we have that freedom to create different things for different sectors and partner with them in innovation that we think will deliver impact in the world. So yeah, stay tuned. The Nonechka project will hopefully continue to grow across Mexico and the US, and I'm keen to see where it goes next.
Excellent. I will start watching for that too, especially the work with Polaris, because Polaris is probably one of the better known NGOs in this area. So that's an exciting partnership with them. Wonderful. I'm glad.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, where can listeners get more information about Ulula, about OWL, about your products, and contact you directly if they have questions or want to follow up?
They can visit ulula.com, so ulula.com. They can also write to us at info@ulula. If they want to reach out directly, they can always find me on LinkedIn. So Vera Belazelkoska, it's a tough name to spell, but I'm sure it's going to be somewhere on the podcast description. So
it will be spelled out very carefully. Yes.
Feel free to find me. I will be the only one, so that's the benefit. There is no other one with such names, so easy to find that way.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time today, Vera. It's been really educational for me and exciting. I'll just tell you, there's a number of times when I've recorded a podcast about human trafficking, and at the end of the podcast, you just think, we are never going to make a difference here. This is like a drop in a bucket, and we're never going to have an impact. And for a change, this is an episode where I'm ending thinking, wow, this really has the potential to bring solutions to scale globally. And it's reaching the right people and it's giving data that can actually be actionable. And I'm feeling hopeful at the end of this episode. So thank you.
I'm
It's
glad.
exciting to find these kinds of projects and solutions out there.
I'm glad. I'm glad I could be a bearer of good news for a change. I'm not always that person. So working in this space, of course, can be sometimes a little bit discouraging. But I also do think that we're seeing the trajectory of change is going in the positive direction. And the work we do is inspiring for me still. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. A quick post-episode note for listeners. After the episode, Vera and I had a conversation, and I want to make it clear for her sake and for Ulula's sake that there are certain parts of the world where Ulula is not currently working, and quite frankly, some places where they cannot currently work. So if you're interested in talking to them about their tool and their technology and their app, please reach out to them directly to get more information about where and where they cannot roll out this technology. Thank you.